I shouldn't have answered the phone, but I did, and my mother's voice came through shaking in that specific way that meant she needed something from me immediately. My dad was in the hospital, and she couldn't drive there because she was too upset and my brother wasn't answering his phone, and could I please come right now? She said it all in one breath without pausing. I was at work in the middle of a meeting, but I said yes, of course, and hung up and made some excuse about a family emergency. My boss looked annoyed but nodded, and I grabbed my jacket and left. In the elevator, I texted my girlfriend that my dad was in the hospital and I had to go, and she responded with, "Oh no, keep me updated," and I felt this flash of irritation that she didn't offer to come with me, but I pushed it down because that wasn't fair. She had her own job and her own life. I picked up my mom, and she cried the entire drive to the hospital, that dramatic kind of crying where she kept saying, "What am I going to do? And what if he dies and I'm all alone?" I kept saying he's going to be fine. We don't even know what happened yet, but she wasn't really listening. At the hospital, they told us he'd had a minor heart attack, emphasis on minor, and they were running tests, but he was stable and we could see him soon. My mom grabbed my arm and said, "Thank God you're here. I couldn't do this without you." And something about the way she said it made me feel tired in a way I couldn't explain. My dad looked small in the hospital bed, hooked up to monitors. He was 62 and had always seemed invincible in that way dads do when you're a kid. But lying there, he just looked old. He saw us and tried to smile and said, "Hey, bit of excitement today, huh?" My mom rushed to his side and started fussing over him and asking the nurses questions, and I stood there feeling useless. My phone buzzed with a text from my girlfriend asking how it was going, and I responded that he was stable, and she sent back a heart emoji. Just a heart emoji. I don't know why that bothered me, but it did. They kept my dad overnight for observation, and my mom refused to leave, so I stayed too. I slept maybe 2 hours in an uncomfortable chair in the waiting room. Around 3 in the morning, my brother finally called me back. He'd been out with friends and hadn't checked his phone. He asked if dad was okay, and I said yes. And he said, "Okay, cool. Let me know if anything changes," and hung up. I sat there staring at my phone, thinking about how I dropped everything and driven across town in the middle of a workday and slept in a hospital chair, and my brother couldn't even be bothered to come by for an hour. But that was normal. That was always how it went. I was the responsible one, and he was the one who got to live his life without obligation. My girlfriend came by in the morning with coffee, and I felt guilty for being irritated with her earlier. She asked how I was doing, and I said fine, and she said, "You look exhausted. Did you sleep here?" I told her I'd stayed with my mom, and she made a face I couldn't quite read and said, "Well, your dad's okay now, right? So maybe you should go home and rest." My mom was within earshot, and she turned and said, "Oh, he can't leave yet. We need to wait for the doctor to make rounds and discuss the treatment plan." My girlfriend looked at me, and I looked at my mom, and I said, "Yeah, I should probably wait for that." My girlfriend said, "Okay, well, I have to get to work, but text me later," and kissed my cheek and left. My mom waited until she was gone, and then said, "I'm glad you're staying. You know, I can't understand all this medical stuff without you." The doctor came by around 10 and explained that my dad needed to make some lifestyle changes, diet and exercise and stress management, but there was no permanent damage, and with the right care, he should be fine. My mom nodded along, but I could tell she wasn't really processing it, so I asked questions and took notes on my phone. After the doctor left, my mom said, "See, I told you I needed you here," and something in her tone made my chest feel tight. My dad was being discharged that afternoon, and my mom asked if I could drive them home and help get him settled. I said yes, even though I'd already missed a full day of work and had a deadline on Friday that I was now behind on. At my parents' house, my mom kept finding things that needed to be done. The living room needed to be rearranged so my dad wouldn't have to walk as far to the bathroom. The kitchen needed to be reorganized so healthy food was easier to access. The yard needed to be checked because what if he tripped on something? I spent 3 hours doing tasks that mostly didn't need doing while my mom supervised and my dad slept on the couch. My brother showed up around 5, stayed for 20 minutes, asked if dad was okay, and left to go to his girlfriend's place. Nobody asked him to stay and help. Nobody expected him to. I didn't get home until almost 8, and I was exhausted in a way that felt deeper than just physical tiredness. My girlfriend had texted asking if I wanted her to bring dinner over, and I'd said, "No, I'm fine," which was a lie, but I didn't have the energy to see anyone. When I walked into my apartment, it felt too quiet. I sat on the couch in the dark for a while, just staring at nothing. My phone rang, and I saw it was my mom, and I almost didn't answer, but guilt made me pick up. She asked if I could come by tomorrow after work to help with some paperwork for my dad's medical bills. I said I had to catch up on work stuff, and she said, oh, her voice going small and hurt. And I caved and said, okay, fine, I'll come by. This became the pattern. Every day after work, I went to my parents' house. My mom always had something that needed doing. Picking up prescriptions, talking to the insurance company, researching heart-healthy recipes, moving furniture, organizing medical documents. My dad would tell her she was being ridiculous, that he was fine, that I didn't need to come over every single day. She'd get upset and say she just wanted to make sure he was taken care of, and was that so wrong? My dad would back down, and I'd stay and do whatever she needed because it was easier than dealing with her being hurt or anxious or whatever she was. Work was starting to suffer. I was distracted and behind on projects, and my boss had already talked to me once about needing to refocus. My girlfriend was getting frustrated too, though she tried not to show it. We did plans 3 times in the past 2 weeks, and I'd canceled all of them because my mom needed something. The 3rd time, my girlfriend said, maybe your brother could help out sometimes, and I said he's busy, and she said you're busy too, and I didn't have a response to that. She apologized and said she knew this was hard, and she was trying to be supportive, but she missed me. I said I missed her too, and I'd make it up to her, but I wasn't sure I meant it. I wasn't sure I felt anything except tired. My coworker Diane asked me one day if I was okay. We'd worked together for 4 years and sometimes got lunch, but we weren't particularly close. I said I was fine, and she gave me this look and said, you don't seem fine. You seem like you're running on empty. I told her about my dad and helping my mom, and she listened and then said, can I ask you something without you getting defensive? I said sure, and she said, why are you the only one doing all this? I started to explain about my brother being busy and my mom needing help, and she cut me off and said, no, I'm asking why you think you're the only one who can handle this. I didn't have an answer for that either. That night, my girlfriend came over, and we were supposed to watch a movie, but halfway through my mom called. I answered, and my girlfriend paused the movie, and I could feel her watching me. My mom was crying about something my dad had said, some comment about how she was being overbearing with the health stuff, and she needed me to talk to him. I said, Mom, he's right there. Can't you just talk to him yourself? And she said, he doesn't listen to me, but he listens to you. I ended up on the phone for 45 minutes, mediating an argument between my parents while my girlfriend sat on the other end of the couch looking at her hands. After I hung up, she said, we need to talk. I said, okay, and she said, I don't think you're okay. I said, I'm just stressed, and she said, no, it's more than that. She said, I've been watching you disappear into this thing with your family, and I don't know how to help you, or if you even want help. She said, every time I try to make plans, you cancel. Every time I ask how you're doing, you say you're fine, but you're clearly not fine. Every time your mom calls, you drop everything no matter what we're doing or what you have going on. I try to defend myself, and she said, I'm not attacking you. I'm worried about you. She said, it seems like you don't have any boundaries with your family, and it's consuming your entire life. I told her she didn't understand. My dad almost died, and my mom can't handle everything alone, and my brother is useless. She said, your dad had a minor heart attack 3 weeks ago, and he's fine now. And your mom is a grown woman who's capable of handling her own life, and your brother is only useless because everyone lets him be. She said, you're not responsible for managing your mother's emotions or your father's health or your brother's lack of participation. I said, someone has to do it. And she said, why does it have to be you? I didn't have an answer, so I said, you just don't get it. And she said, you're right. I don't get it. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're letting your family treat you like their personal assistant, and you're so used to it you don't even see it anymore. We didn't fight exactly, but the conversation ended badly. She left, and I felt angry in a way I couldn't articulate. Angry at her for not understanding. Angry at my family for needing so much. Angry at myself for being angry. I didn't sleep well that night. I kept thinking about what she'd said about boundaries and responsibility and whether she was right. But she wasn't right because she didn't know my family. She didn't know how my mom got when she was anxious, or how my dad shut down when things got difficult, or how my brother had always just checked out of anything hard. I was the one who held everything together. I was the glue. Without me, everything would fall apart. Except things were already falling apart. My boss called me into her office on Friday and said my performance had been declining and she needed to see improvement, or we'd need to have a more serious conversation about my position. My girlfriend had barely texted me all week. My dad was fine, but my mom was still calling me every day with new crises that turned out to be nothing. And I felt like I was moving through water, everything taking twice as much effort as it should, everything feeling heavy and wrong. Diane asked me to lunch, and I almost said no, but she insisted. At the restaurant, she said, "I'm going to tell you something, and you're going to want to argue with me, but I need you to just listen first." I said okay, and she said, "I think you're depressed." I started to protest, and she held up her hand and said, "I said listen first." She said, "I had a therapist a few years ago who told me that some people outsource their entire sense of self-worth to other people's needs. And when those people are struggling, it's not usually because they're naturally generous or responsible. It's because they've been conditioned to believe their value lies in being useful." She said, "Watching you these past few weeks reminded me of how I was before I got help." She said, "You look like someone who's forgotten how to exist outside of what other people need from you." I sat there not knowing what to say. She said, "I know you probably think I'm overstepping, and maybe I am, but I care about you as a friend, and I don't want to watch you burn yourself out for people who aren't even appreciating what you're sacrificing." I said, "My mom appreciates it," and Diane said, "Does she though? Does she actually say thank you, or does she just find the next thing she needs help with?" I thought about it and realized I couldn't remember the last time my mom had actually thanked me. It was always just the next task, the next crisis, the next thing I needed to fix. That weekend, my mom called and asked if I could come organize my dad's medications because the pharmacy had given them a new system and she didn't understand it. I was supposed to spend the day with my girlfriend, our first real time together in almost a month. I started to say yes to my mom automatically, and then I stopped. I said, "Actually, Mom, I can't today." There was a long silence, and then she said, "Oh." Just "oh," but in that wounded tone she used when she wanted me to feel guilty. I said, "The pharmacy can help you with that. And if not, Dad can figure it out. He's not incapable." She said, "Well, I guess if you're too busy," and I said, "I'm not too busy. I just have other plans." She said, "I see. Okay then, we'll manage somehow," and hung up. I felt terrible, physically sick with guilt. My girlfriend came over and I told her what happened, and she said, "How do you feel?" I said, "I feel like a horrible son," and she said, "Why?" I said, "Because my mom needed help," and I said no. She looked at me for a long time and said, "Your mom needed you to organize pill bottles. She didn't need life-saving surgery. Your dad is perfectly capable of handling his own medication. You're not a horrible son for having boundaries." But it didn't feel like boundaries. It felt like abandonment. My mom didn't call me for 3 days. On the third day, my brother texted me saying, "Mom's upset that you're not coming around anymore." I called him and said I came around every single day for 3 weeks. I took 1 day off. He said, "Yeah, but you know how she is." I said, "Why don't you go help her then?" And he said, "I don't know how to do all that medical stuff." I said, "It's pill bottles. You're 26 years old. You can figure out pill bottles." He said, "Why are you being like this?" And I said, "I'm tired. I'm really tired." He didn't respond to that. My girlfriend and I had dinner that night, and halfway through, I just started crying. Not dramatic crying, just tears running down my face while I tried to eat pasta. She reached across the table and took my hand and didn't say anything, just waited. Eventually, I said, "I don't know how to not be the person who fixes everything." She said, "You don't have to fix everything." I said, "But if I don't, who will?" She said, "Maybe nobody, and maybe that's okay. Maybe some things don't need to be fixed by you. Maybe some people need to learn to handle their own problems." I thought about Diane saying I'd been conditioned to believe my value was in being useful. I thought about my mom's wounded silences and my brother's convenient helplessness and my dad's passive acceptance of it all. I thought about how I'd been doing this my whole life, taking care of everyone, making sure everything ran smoothly, being the responsible one. And I thought about how exhausted I was, how I didn't remember the last time I'd done something just because I wanted to, how every decision I made was based on what someone else needed from me. My girlfriend said, "I think you need to talk to someone, a therapist." I said, "I don't have time for therapy," and she said, "You don't have time not to." She said, "You're burning out and you're taking our relationship down with you, and I don't want to give you an ultimatum, but I can't keep being in a relationship with someone who isn't actually present." I said, "Are you breaking up with me?" And she said, "No. I'm telling you I need you to get help because I love you, but I can't watch you do this to yourself anymore." I made an appointment with a therapist, and the first session was uncomfortable in a way that made me want to never go back. She asked me about my family and my relationship and my work, and then she asked me who I was outside of all those roles. I didn't understand the question. She said if you weren't your mother's helper or your girlfriend's boyfriend or your company's employee, who would you be? What would you want? I sat there and I genuinely couldn't answer. I didn't know. I couldn't remember ever asking myself that question. The therapist gave me homework. She said, I want you to say no to one request this week. Doesn't matter what it is or who asks. Just practice saying no without apologizing or explaining. My mom called 2 days later asking if I could drive her to the grocery store because she didn't feel like going alone. I said no, I can't today. She said, oh, is everything okay? I said yes, I just can't today. There was a pause, and she said, well, all right then, I guess I'll figure something out. I didn't apologize. I didn't offer an explanation. I just said, okay, let me know if you need anything urgent. And I hung up, and I felt like I'd done something wrong, but also something important. My girlfriend noticed a change before I did. She said, you seem different lately. I asked if that was good or bad, and she said, I don't know yet. We were having more conversations, but they were harder conversations. About what I wanted versus what I thought I should want. About why I struggled so much with disappointing people. About whether I'd ever actually wanted to be the responsible one, or if I'd just fallen into that role and never questioned it. She was patient, but I could tell she was tired too. Tired of having the same conversations. Tired of me not changing fast enough. Things came to a head when my dad had a follow-up appointment, and my mom called asking if I could take them. I said I had a work deadline, and she said it's just an hour. I said I really can't, and she said fine, your brother can do it. I said okay, and she said although you know he'll probably show up late or forget completely. I said then maybe you should remind him, and she said I shouldn't have to. He should just be responsible. I said maybe, but that's between you and him, not my problem to solve. She was quiet and then said you've been different lately. Cold. I said I'm not cold. I'm just not available to fix everything anymore. She said, I don't ask you to fix everything, and I said, Mom, you call me almost every day with something you need. She said, because you're the only one I can count on. And there it was. The thing that had been making me feel important and special and needed my whole life. You're the only one I can count on, which meant if I stopped being that person, who was I? I talked about it in therapy, and the therapist said, you've constructed your entire identity around being needed. When people don't need you, you feel worthless. I said that's not true, and she said, okay, so what are you good at that has nothing to do with helping other people? I couldn't think of anything. She said, what do you enjoy doing just for yourself? I said, I don't know. I don't really have time for hobbies. She said, you don't have time, or you don't let yourself have time. I sat with that question, and it made me feel exposed in a way I didn't like. My girlfriend and I had plans for the weekend, and Friday night my mom called saying my dad was having chest pains, and they were going to the emergency room. And could I meet them there? I said yes immediately and hung up and told my girlfriend I had to go. She looked at me and said, is this real, or was this your mom being anxious? I said, what kind of question is that? My dad is having chest pains. She said, your dad had chest pains last week and it was indigestion. And the week before that, and it was heartburn. I said, this could be serious. And she said, or it could be your mom panicking again and pulling you into it. I said, I have to go. And she said, I know you do. But I'm not coming with you this time. At the hospital, my dad was annoyed. He told the nurse he told his wife it was just gas, but she'd insisted on coming in. My mom was defensive and said better safe than sorry. The doctor examined him and said it was in fact gas and maybe some stress-related muscle tension. My mom said, see, it could have been serious. I sat there thinking about my girlfriend saying, or it could be your mom panicking again and pulling you into it. I stayed until they discharged him and drove them home, and my mom kept saying, thank God you came. I don't know what we would have done without you. My dad didn't say anything. When I got home, my girlfriend's stuff was mostly gone from my apartment. Not all of it, but enough that I noticed immediately. There was a note on the kitchen counter. It said, I need some space to think about things. I'm not breaking up with you, but I need you to figure out what you actually want. Because I don't think you know. And I can't be in a relationship with someone who doesn't know who they are outside of their family's drama. Call me when you figured it out. I read it 3 times and felt empty and angry and like she was being unfair. But also like maybe she wasn't. I didn't call her. I wanted therapy instead. I said, I think my girlfriend is leaving me because I won't abandon my family. The therapist said, is that what she's asking you to do? I said, she wants me to have boundaries. She said, and you think having boundaries means abandoning your family. I said, I don't know what it means. She said it means recognizing that you're not responsible for managing other people's lives. It means understanding that helping people because you want to is different from helping people because you need to feel needed. She asked me why I'd gone to the hospital, and I said because my dad was having chest pains. She said, "Did you believe it was serious?" I sat there and realized I hadn't. I'd known it probably wasn't serious. I'd gone anyway because my mom had asked, and I couldn't say no to her distress, even when I knew it was disproportionate to the situation. The therapist said, "You're 29 years old, and you're living like you're still a child who needs to earn his place in the family." I said that's not true, and she said, "Then why do you feel guilty every time you prioritize your own needs? Why do you feel like you're only valuable when you're solving someone else's problems?" I didn't have an answer. She said, "I think you need to examine why you need to be needed, what you're getting out of being the family hero." I said, "I'm not getting anything out of it. It's exhausting." She said, "Exactly. So why do you keep doing it?" I started paying attention to how I felt when my mom called. That spike of anxiety, that immediate yes before she'd even finished asking. The need to fix whatever was wrong so she'd be okay and I could relax. Except I never relaxed because there was always something else. I started thinking about my brother and how angry I was that he didn't help, but also how I'd never actually asked him to help. How I just assumed the role of responsible son, and he'd assumed the role of uninvolved son, and we'd both stayed in those roles for decades because it was easier than changing. I called my brother and said we need to talk. He said about what, and I said about mom and dad and how this is going to work going forward. He got defensive immediately and said, "What's that supposed to mean?" I said, "It means I'm not doing everything anymore, and you're going to need to step up." He said, "I didn't ask you to do everything," and I said, "I know, but I did it anyway, and now I'm stopping." He said, "Mom needs help," and I said she needs help from both of us, not just me. He was quiet, and then said, "I don't know how to do the stuff you do." I said, "Then figure it out. You're an adult." He said, "You sound different," and I said, "I am different." My mom called the next day and asked if I could come help her set up a new phone. I said, "I can't today." She said, "It'll only take a few minutes." I said, "Ask someone at the phone store. They'll help you." She said, "But you know how to do it." I said, "Mom, I can't help you with everything." There was a long silence, and then she said, "Are you upset with me?" I said, "No, I'm just setting some boundaries." She said, "What does that mean?" I said, "It means I'm not available to drop everything every time you need something small. If it's an emergency, I'll be there, but I can't keep coming over for things you can handle yourself." She said, "I see," and her voice went cold. I said, "Mom, please don't do this." She said, "Do what?" I said, "Make me feel guilty for having my own life." She said, "I never asked you to give up your life." I said, "You kind of did, though. Every time you tell me I'm the only one you can count on, every time you call me instead of figuring it out yourself, every time you make me feel like I'm abandoning you if I say no." There was a long pause, and she hung up. I called my dad separately and said we need to talk about Mom. He said, "What about her?" I said, "She relies on me too much, and it's not healthy for either of us." He said, "Your mother is anxious. You know that." I said, "I know that, but me enabling her anxiety isn't helping her." He said, "You're not enabling. You're being a good son." I said, "Dad, I'm burned out. I can't keep doing this." He was quiet and then said, "She's not going to take this well." I said, "I know." He said, "She's going to make this about her and play the victim." I said, "I know that too, but I have to do this anyway." My girlfriend called me a week later. She said, "I think we should meet up and talk." We met at a coffee shop, and it was awkward in a way our relationship had never been before. She said, "I've been thinking a lot about us." I said, "Me too." She said, "I love you, but I don't know if I can be with someone who's still figuring out who they are." I said, "I'm in therapy. I'm working on it." She said, "I know, and I'm glad, but I think you need to do that work without me." I felt my chest get tight and said, "You're breaking up with me." She said, "I think I need to." She said, "I've been holding space for you to figure yourself out, and it's been exhausting for me too." She said, "I need a partner who's present, who knows what they want, who doesn't need me to be patient while they learn how to have boundaries with their family." I said, "That's not fair." She said, "Maybe not, but it's honest." We sat there for a while not saying anything. Finally, I said, "I understand." She looked surprised and said, "You do?" I said, "Yeah, I've been asking you to wait for me to become someone I'm not sure I know how to be, and that's not fair to you." She said, "I really hope you figure it out." I said, "Me too." We hugged, and it felt final, and I walked to my car and sat there feeling hollow, but also relieved in a way I didn't want to examine too closely. My mom didn't call me for 2 weeks. My brother texted saying she was hurt and confused about why I was pulling away. I didn't respond. My dad called once and said, "Your mother's upset." And I said, "I know." And he said, "Are you going to do anything about it?" And I said no, She's upset because I'm setting boundaries, and that's okay. He said, I don't understand what's happening with you lately. I said, I'm just trying to figure out who I am outside of being everyone's solution to everything. He didn't seem to know what to say to that. I kept going to therapy. I started doing things I couldn't remember ever doing just for myself. I took a photography class because it seemed interesting. I went to movies alone. I read books that had nothing to do with self-improvement or family dynamics. I said no to things I didn't want to do without apologizing. It felt strange and selfish and also kind of good. My coworker Diane asked how I was doing, and I said better, I think. She said, you look less tired. I said, I feel less tired, but also kind of lost. She said, that makes sense. You're building a new foundation. I said, I don't know if I'm doing it right. She said, there is no right way. You're just doing it. My mom finally called after 3 weeks. She said, I think we should talk. I went to her house, and she sat across from me at the kitchen table and said, I've been talking to your father about everything, and I don't understand why you're so angry with me. I said, I'm not angry with you. She said, then why are you abandoning me? I said, I'm not abandoning you. I'm just not available to solve every small problem anymore. She said, those aren't small problems to me. I said, then maybe you need to talk to someone about your anxiety instead of making it my responsibility. She looked hurt and said, I can't believe you're saying this to me. I said, Mom, I love you, but I can't keep living like this. She said, living like what? I said, living like my only value is in being useful to you. We talked in circles for an hour. She cried and said she'd only ever asked for help because I seemed so willing to give it. I said I was willing because I didn't know how to say no. She said that's not my fault. I said I'm not saying it's your fault. I'm saying the dynamic isn't healthy and I need to change it. She said, so you're blaming me? I said no. I'm taking responsibility for my part in it and asking you to understand that things need to be different now. She said, I don't know how to do that. I said, then maybe we both need to figure it out. I left feeling drained, but not defeated. My dad walked me to my car and said, you know, she really does love you. I said, I know. He said, she's just used to things being a certain way. I said, I'm not that way anymore. He looked at me for a long time and said, I can see that. Then he said, for what it's worth, I think you're doing the right thing. It was the first time he'd acknowledged any of this, and it made my throat tight. It's been 3 months now. My mom calls me once a week instead of every day. The conversations are shorter and less crisis-oriented. My brother has started helping more, mostly because my mom doesn't have another option. My girlfriend and I are done, and I'm not sure how I feel about that except that it needed to happen. I'm still in therapy and still figuring out who I am when I'm not defined by other people's needs. It's uncomfortable and uncertain, and I don't have any answers yet. Some days I feel guilty for setting boundaries. Some days I feel relieved. Most days I feel both. My therapist says that's normal. I'm trying to believe her. I don't know what happens next or who I'm becoming. I just know I can't go back to who I was. That's something, I guess.